I am John Galante. I'm president of AE Ventures, the folks that produce the Tech Home Builder and Housing Transformation Summit and provide builders other information and advice on innovation. And I'm really excited today for this webcast, which we're titling Follow the Money. It's a companion to a special report that we developed over the last several months that we think has some interesting opportunities for the industry. And we kind of define that as residential developers, builders, technology vendors, and integrators. I want to provide a little bit of background on this project, and I'm going to flip to the next slide here if the user interface will cooperate. That's always the question. There it is. So I am joined, my partner in crime today, we're going to make this as conversational as we can, is John Twat, who I've actually known almost 30 years. We connected back when I was executive director of the Security Industry Association in the mid-90s. And John had his own firm at the time, and he did work for us on the video surveillance for public safety area. And I know him to be, I was in Washington, D.C. for 18 years and had contact here and there with the government relations industry there. And John is one of the hardest working, most detail oriented professionals in that space. There's a lot of schmoozers who, like to pass checks to PACs and such to win influence. And I'm sure John's firm has, activities in that realm as well, but they're rich on information and ideas. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate about John. And his work for us in terms of developing this information and this report actually was an outgrowth of another activity while we were waiting for the pandemic to clear. We were working on new event concepts, one of which was called Rural Innovator, and it was about the arrival of broadband in the rural landscape and how that would affect smart farming and community-based technologies in the rural area. And John was doing a lot of information collection for us, interfaced with the USDA. And we decided late last year to put that project on ice. And we said, well, we've collected all of this really interesting information, and how can we make it useful? And we really, John turned on the dime in December and repurposed his research for the constituencies we talked about, right? For developers, builders, integrators, tech vendors, and such. And so we think we have some interesting information and opportunities in this report. And I did want to just provide a little bit of background, and I appreciate John and his ability to make that pivot for us so that we have something useful for the folks we've been serving for many, many years. So John, I'm going to let you introduce yourself briefly. It says there you're Senior VP at Mckeon Group. Give us 30 seconds, 45 seconds on you and the firm.
Yes, I appreciate your comments, John. And I started out on Capitol Hill actually in 1971 and served in every position, chief of staff, committee staff, up on Capitol Hill, served in ComSat Corporation, private sector, government relations. And then I opened up my own firm for at least 3 decades and had trade association corporate clients, and affiliated 4 years ago with the former chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Buck Mckeon, who I respect very, very greatly. We concentrate on areas of national defense, foreign affairs, and various economic sectors. And so I have vast experience in authorizing and appropriating up on Capitol Hill, and I always enjoy time with you too, John.
All right. Well, let's dig into the meat of the presentation, and I want to let our audience know if you have questions along the way. I think we're going to ask you to use the technology to wave your hand or to put something in the chat box, and even along the way, we'll ask questions at the end. But if you have questions along the way, just let us know, and we'll make this conversational. Try to get to the bottom of that stuff. So in terms of what we're going to cover, there's a lot to cover on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Let's call it the IIJA to save a bunch of syllables and time along the way. So that's actual legislation that was passed last November and signed into law, and its implementation is pending. And there's several areas of interest there that we will cover. There are also a number of, unfortunately, we've got this dysfunctional legislative process in the United States for the past many years, and we're still working on 2022 appropriations, even though the fiscal year started last October or November, but there's still appropriations to be passed, and there's some opportunities embedded there. There's other bills under consideration beyond these appropriations bills where there's relevant to the broadband expansion that we're going to cover. And we're going to dive into some regulation and rulemaking that's urgent and where you might want to pay attention and take action. And then we're going to just talk about conceptually, John and I had a pre-game call a couple of hours ago, and there is a lot of process to talk, but I mean, we don't want to do the, the 101 on how a bill passes, et cetera, before we get your attention with the dollar signs. So let's look through the dollar signs and the opportunities. Then we can talk about process issues, how you can stay on top of this stuff, how you can influence rulemaking and regulation potentially. And if those are things of interest, but maybe beyond your ability to do because of discomfort or bandwidth, how Mckeon or AE Ventures might help going forward. So that's what we're going to try to cover today. So the IIJA, John, we've got 4 major areas that we identified opportunity in. Can we take these one by one and kind of give a high level overview of what we think let's talk about what the programs are a little bit and what we think the opportunities might be there. I guess let's start with this broadband equity, which is first in the report, the broadband grants to states, right? Which is from the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, $42.5 billion. Can you give us some specifics there, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So aside from all the summaries that everyone might have seen that are following this, I am not going to relay how the $42 billion in this one part has been allocated. But I will go over some important highlights in this part. As you can see, there are 4 different parts of the infrastructure bill, and the infrastructure bill itself is trillions of dollars. This is just the division of the 62 billion plus for broadband. So in the first part, this is a major outreach of monies that's being developed right now by the federal government to state entities. And the first thing that we want to highlight is that by May of this year, that's just March, April, May, that's 90 days from now, the Assistant Secretary of Commerce, it's mostly NTIA, will develop a broadband equity, notice the word equity, access and deployment program. The key takeaway here is looking at the law that was signed on November 15th There are some anchor institutions that the states, as the money flows from Washington to the states, that's embedded in the law. And these anchor institutions are good recipients of money by the states, include a school, a library, a health clinic, a health center, a hospital, a medical provider, public safety, public housing enterprise, and we'll see that come up over and over again. And then the high cost the high cost areas that the state, together with the federal department, will determine the allocations of the funding. So I would say that one of the key takeaways from this project is that each state will be allocated over a 5-year period, $100 million, and that includes DC and Puerto Rico. And the other takeaway is that the first priority for funding will be distributed on the basis of maps that are being developed now by the FCC, NTIA, and others in the location within the state based on the MBPS, underserved areas and unserved. There's a key distinction in this bill put in by the majority that there's a difference between underserved and unserved. And one example of that, which is greatly impacts this first section, there was a hearing last week in the Indian Affairs Committee headed by Senator Schatz, and one of the tribal representatives secured unanimity with Senator from Alaska and also Schatz from Hawaii, that that a lot of areas within the state have not been connected, and that they don't even have the 25/3 Mbps. So there's a lot of requirements that's being developed in this part, John. And quick answer to you, starting on March 9th through May 11th, the NTIA is developing a series, it looks like twice a month, of major webinars to go into the deep dive on the requirements for this and also for the other three. So that's my
John, are those like draft provisions that they're looking for a commentary on, or are they actually presenting the program in those ways?
No, they're actually presenting, because remember, I had just mentioned that there's a 90-day period where they got to come out with a program. Yeah. So they're actually presenting the requirements that they've been circulating on how that 100 million and how the grant applications will be reviewed by NTIA.
So is that, and you mentioned that there's distribution to the states. So is this going to be about how those dollars are distributed to the states and what strings are attached? Or is it really more applicable for the folks in industry that may be seeking to win grants? What do you have a sense of that?
Yes, I do have a sense, and certainly the report doesn't include dozens and dozens of examples of all 50 states and 6 territories that has received billions of dollars up until last year, and the allocations internally within a state for broadband expansion. So the quick answer to you is that the 100 million, or the 42.4 billion over a period of maybe 3 or 4 or 5 fiscal years is really in coordination with state officials, many of whom already have broadband offices and a functioning system to distribute it.
Yeah, and so the grants that are available for folks in industry would come through state level entities that are funded by the federal government. Is that generally the rule, or are they going to be working directly with the federal agencies to win those grants?
The formula grants, which this will be a part of, are allocated by population, but more importantly, they'll be allocated according to equity in unserved and underserved, based on the FCC and mapping data as to connectivity. So it's a two-part process. These maps are very, very important in the allocation process.
Yeah, and those maps aren't scheduled to be due or done until next May 2023. Is that correct?
Well, actually, it's in the fall, but they're ongoing, and I would say that it's going to take at least 6 to 7 months before the mapping is completed. But the initial, John, the initial requirements for this state grant program are very much already out there by the federal agencies.
And in terms of where grant dollars can go, is it strictly to broadband access providers, or do companies that design and install community-wide infrastructure have a shot at funding? Do companies that design and install intra-premises CPE, so to speak, infrastructure, do they have a shot at realizing funding or matching funding and such, or is that kind of TBD?
Your question transitions all these other areas as well, as far as where the funds can be used. But basically, in this area for this grant program, it's for unserved service projects and underserved projects, connecting eligible community anchor institutions, some of them I've mentioned already, installing internet and Wi-Fi infrastructure, or providing reduced cost broadband within a multi-family residential building. Now, this last one, hopefully we'll have a couple minutes to talk about. That's a key term of art for HUD assisted community tenant access to broadband.
Right.
Okay.
And you mentioned a distinction between unserved and underserved. Is underserved, is the general meaning of that socioeconomic disadvantaged communities, and unserved would be more about location-based, rural, let's say? I mean, help us understand that distinction.
Yes, basically, due to time limitation, underserved, the formula that this administration has put together is the poverty line. Okay. Those that live in various communities or that have poverty line income. And unserved is an example of, let's say, a tribe which was up in Congress last week, right, in Alaska, that is unserved because they're in a location that broadband connectivity has not been
right
achieved.
Right. Yeah. So the two big buckets are underserved from a socioeconomic perspective, and then unserved due to geography-based sort of facts.
Yes. Right. Yes, and the takeaway from this webinar that we're doing here, and we don't have time to go into it, is that those are two very important points, at least for the next 12 to 24 months going forward on all of this. Yeah. Is a priority, which of course can be changed over time. And I do want to make one other point on this state allocation, which appears in all the other ones as well. This is the first bill, actually law, that I've seen that transcends fiscal years. And again, I don't have time to go into it. I alluded it in the report, but it's strange because it includes fiscal year 22, which we're in now that you talked about. But some of them go all the way to fiscal 28, all the way to fiscal 31. And most of these implementations for all four of these are in a 5-year period. So it right. seeks to influence, a lot of funding along the way.
And so one other point in this area before we move on. So rural. I think there's maybe some misconceptions about rural, but let's discuss this. I don't know whether I'm off base or not, but rural doesn't necessarily have to be 300 miles or 3,000 miles from a major city, right? Rural can be an hour and a half drive from a big city where it's a rural locale that's been, not well served for whatever reason in terms of the deployment of the broadband infrastructure. Am I correct on that?
Yes, you're very correct. And again, we don't have time, excuse me, to go into this, but the definition of rural is very, very important. For example, last week, Senator Thune, and it's a bipartisan bill, it's one page, increases the access for households to be served by broadband from 50% in a rural area to 80%. So the Congress itself, as well as NTIA and the Ag Department, everybody has different definitions of the area to be served in a rural sense. And so Congress is more and more advocating that the target for this, at least in the initial stages, is rural America, where connectivity is not as prevalent as in urban areas. But one last question, one last point. In the urban areas, you have the major issue of the underserved. And so there's a sort of a two different
The more the
definition.
affordable housing side of things in an urban setting. But I think for our builder friends and residential developers who are often in collar counties, kind of breaking the new ground for the metropolitan area sprawl, there could be the potential to tap into some of this funding and support for their community-wide infrastructure, correct?
Well, that, excuse me, that may be true. However, this administration is also trying to do a two-track process to involve the Ag Department and as many federal agencies into the rural aspect of what you just asked.
Gotcha.
So it's two things at the same
Gotcha.
time.
So did we cover these four squares pretty well? Or is there any place that we need to dive in a little bit? What is the Appalachian Regional Commission? Briefly, 13
Yes, that is a good point. The Appalachian Regional Commission has quite a lot of political clout, shall we say. It's based on about 31 Appalachian state offices with a headquarters in Washington. And they have a
13, right, Joe?
special,
13 states, 13, not 31 on Appalachia. It's what we've got in our report.
it's 13.
Yeah.
So I just transposed the 3. But it's Appalachia, and it's been targeted since Depression. I won't go into a history of it,
Yeah.
but they have a special allocation of funding within this bill for broadband eligible projects in their region. And the monies for this is quite large, as I indicated in the report.
Right.
And the monies in that case will be going to the state, and that's in addition to the other monies that we had in the first part of it.
Right. And then the middle mile broadband thing is more about getting connectivity in terms of the wide area network more broadly distributed. It might not have all that much relevance for builders, developers, et cetera, except to the point that there's more hardwired access coming to those communities via the middle mile broadband infrastructure, right?
Well, that is correct, but it does bring into language again. All 4 of these bring into language of the last mile, and the last mile could also be a tenancy in a very large apartment complex or in a HUD assisted program. So let me just take 2 seconds and tell you about a provision that's in a HUD appropriation bill that requires, out of the, I don't know, 80 million that they get for HUD for research, to take a look at the impact in assisted housing on how those people can secure broadband connectivity. And one of the directions that Congress has given it is to look at their utility bills. And there's a whole bunch of language. I think I referenced it in 2 seconds in the report, but there's an actual docket and a regulatory process. And it's very interesting because this theme of adding money for a utility bill also impacts landlords and owners of individual multi-family or multiple apartment complexes around the country.
Very good. Well, let's keep moving. How should we move to pending legislation?
Yes, the Build Back, I want to do the Build Back Better bill if I could before the other two.
Okay.
Of course, this one is stuck. It's stuck in the Senate. It may not move, but these individual provisions might be moved forward. And they have some interesting provisions in this bill. The first one is that, excuse me, a town, and this I found fascinating, a local government or an Indian tribe could get credit for operations and maintenance costs for a government-owned broadband, credit in the amount of 30% for every household that subscribes in a qualified household to get broadband connectivity. It's an interesting concept, and it's $400 per household. So it's if a local government or even a state government owns a broadband and they're trying to get it in there, this gives them for low-income communities and other places, an interesting profitability area. The other one is that there's $9.5 billion in this bill from 22 until FY 31 for a small manufacturer under equity to get a venture small business investment to include broadband as a covered investment. And that's a lot of money to give for that. And finally, there's something in here that gives $41 million from FY 22 to 26 for the Bureau of Indian Education, a separate allocation for that. Now, the first one is
the small manufacturer piece. So the manufacturer themselves is able to tap these funds for the access fees and infrastructure for their ongoing broadband services. So we're just trying to bring the information age to light manufacturing in rural settings. Is that kind of what's going on there?
That's correct. They're looking for another vehicle to pour money into a particular area. The first one is a $2.4 billion extra allocation that was unanimously almost supported by both Republicans and Democrats in the House Agriculture Committee about last month. It's pending in the House. It has to go through one more committee. And this is an effort on the part of the Agriculture Department to incur more money for FY 22 through FY 29 for projects for rural America.
Hey, John, can I just stop you there for 1 second? Because one thing we didn't cover that we did cover in the preamble of the report is this is one area where there's true bipartisanship, you know, that both Dems and Republicans support this broadband expansion. I just think it bodes well for the long-term sustained funding in this area, that it doesn't have a natural enemy, at least at this point. We'll see what happens. But right now, it's pretty darn bipartisan. You've got a lot of chairmen and ranking members agreeing and supporting and sponsoring each other's initiatives in this area. So something that's important to note, I think.
Yes, that's a good point. There are two other concepts on this pending legislation I want to get across. First is earmarks are pork. The bridge to nowhere, everybody knows what that is. They were banned by Congress for 10 years. They were put in this last year, and there's one more cycle going on now for fiscal 23, which will start in a couple of weeks. And I reviewed 5,000, because they love earmarks, 5,000 earmarks, and was able to determine that $79 million in the last cycle for all the appropriation bills dealt with broadband expansion. And a good part of the report includes a footnote that lists the 31 projects that individual members and a lot of senators also put in these projects for their individual districts. They're usually 1 to 2 million. Most of them are under $1 million, but it's a great example of extra monies that can be put in. Yeah. Now, in the HUD bill, there's something called a Cdbg, Community Development Block Grants. And this is in the billions. And a community development block grant can be used for economic development. And you and I worked on projects 3 decades ago for a Cdbg for CCTV for public safety. But not to go back.
There's no cannabis involved in this, right?
I know. Okay. Not to go back into history, but the bottom line is that there are dozens of Cdbgs put in by city governments for HUD funding for installation of broadband expansion, broadband equipment, and broadband connectivity. So I would estimate there's maybe $70 to $100 million in addition to all these billions of dollars that can be allocated to broadband in a bipartisan sense, although the Republicans, if they take over in November, will ban earmarks. But most of the broadband expansion for the next year will be funded through these particular earmarks, because the agencies are flushed with money at the moment.
Very good. Let's keep going, huh? So these fast-moving need to be tended to urgently, regulation and rulemaking stuff that's going on here. Can you give us the highlights?
Say again?
These the regulatory and rulemaking areas where we highlighted some in the report. I guess we talked about the community, the Cdbgs. Yes. Off-campus broadband expansion. You want to touch on that?
I would like, in the limited time, I don't mind doing that. I did have a couple of things that don't appear in the report as well. Yeah. My general comment to you and to people listening on those 3 areas in the regulatory process, there's dozens and dozens of regulatory dockets from the FCC, the NTIA, the Ag Department, rural sections. It's almost every agency, rights of way by the Transportation Department. Every federal agency of the 12 departments, I think, has except NASA, has a regulatory process for communicating and not communicating. But I did want to highlight 2 of them that or a major one that I thought was very, very important. And that came out last week. And it was put up by the FCC. And for all our friends who listen to this, they might know that in 2016, there was a label requirement to inform consumers about broadband. And what this particular regulation, and it was put in February 7th by the FCC. If anybody wants, they can contact you or me to look at it. It's in the Federal Register. It goes through a very detailed expansion of the point of sale to consumers and of how broadband connectivity should be transparent. And there's a lot of hidden things in this. The comments are due by March 9th. I think by April and May, the FCC will put it out. But there's requirements for ISPs to display very detailed information, not just in the label, but also to the consumer prior to broadband connectivity. For example, bundling, information on pricing, a whole host. I won't go into all these because this whole thing is like 20, 30 pages, but I thought that was very interesting.
So that's more on the threats side of things than the opportunities. It's potentially onerous
Yes.
regulatory rules there that folks should be aware of and maybe try to influence to make it more
Yes, and the
still
last,
consumer centric, but not onerous. Yeah.
yes, and the last one that I want to highlight among thousands that I could is January 10th, which is only a month away. NTIA, which is the huge agency within commerce that's distributing the 42 billion. I thought this was so interesting because what they're doing is they're requesting comments on broadband connectivity from stakeholders on how to do things. What does that signal? That signals to me that all the federal officials that are in these agencies, a lot of them may not know the details that your listeners or the people that could read this report or understand ISP and connectivity, they need help. And they issued a Federal Register request for stakeholder input, which I think is very important.
Well, do you want to provide the little process-oriented tutorial for the folks who are listening in terms of how do you stay on top of this stuff? How do you take action? I broke it into legislation and regulation and rulemaking. And
Sure.
I know that there's federal level and state level, but however you could simplify it and give people kind of the broad landscape would be, I think, good.
And you realize it's hard for me to simplify things, you know that.
You and I, we share a passion for complexity. That's why.
I understand. I understand. So for the people listening, the simple is that Congress has digital access for information if you know where to look on a daily basis. The Bible of Congress, as far as I'm concerned, is congress.gov. And congress.gov, you can put a bill in. It'll give you, all the information you need about a bill. If you have a request about a member, I don't mean a request, but information. So tracking legislation can be done if you have a bill number. You can also do a Control F, which can bring up individual subject matters. So for example, the 2,000-page infrastructure bill, the Control F on broadband brings up 361 hits. So it is possible through digitization to track information that comes from Congress, as well as information on committees. Committee hearings are listed every Friday on that congress.gov by committees, and so on. So there's a way to do that for regulation.
That's the tracking piece. Let's take some of the fear factor out of communicating with legislators, right? Like, I mean, what?
Well, there are two types of, in this short time that we have, I guess there are two types of legislators for your viewing audience here. One are staff and members who are intimate in daily communications, telecommunications, broadband issues. And they need to be communicated in a much more detailed manner. So I'll use my friend Senator Thune as an example, or Senator Wicker, or any ranking or chairman of a committee that has jurisdiction on broadband. They need more detail, and they need to be very, very carefully presented with information. And then there's the rest of Congress, and the rest of Congress really, they look, especially in 2022, to the impact of broadband or the lack of it on education and access to information, and from a political sense, what the impact in the business community could be.
Right. So if we want to get in the weeds on specific provisions, we really want to be talking to folks who are on the committees with jurisdiction who are reviewing this stuff on a more daily way, in a more daily way. And then if we're trying to affect a vote at some point, we just want to kind of wave the flag on it, right?
Yeah, I guess the bottom line on that is if a company or a group of people want to excuse me, change a policy or impact on a grant or whatever it is, the two types of people are very important, because the majority of Congress will look to the leaders, the chairman and the ranking member, for their input, and will send letters and support to agencies. But that's not necessarily you can achieve your purpose. So you have to have it very carefully planned out who you talk to. There's 2,000 or 3,000 key staff people up on Capitol Hill. It is a very immense place, but it is manageable. And if you know what you're asking for, you can achieve quite a lot. And by the way, that earmark that I mentioned, many of the guidelines come up in the next 60 days for this fiscal 23 cycle that we're going to be coming into.
Yeah. You mentioned real quickly, John, that the legislators or their staff will communicate with the agencies. They will. That's a way to affect the rulemaking and the regulations as well, because there's the they don't just throw it over the wall. They do, but they continue to stay in touch with the agencies, and they can influence the folks within the executive branch on the rulemakings. Is that correct?
Oh, excuse me. Excuse me. Absolutely. If a particular company has a broadband proposal and it impacts a certain congressional district or a senator, and the agency is in charge of funding it, and it helps that particular area, that's a very key bit of information to not put pressure, but to bring it from the bottom of the stack up to the top. And John, in the limited time, let me just talk about regulations for 1 second.
Right.
For each of the agencies that are involved in what we're talking about here, for example, FCC, all of them have websites, fcc.gov. They're all linked digitally. You can put the same subject matter. Getting to the right person is a very key thing, because the agencies are very, very big. The Federal Register, which is listed on there, has its own website. Every day, the Federal Register has all of the government documents, and those are also arranged by agency and by department. It is a little bit more difficult due to the enormity of the funding that these agencies have now been allocated. And I say that because they have a limited staff, and because of that outreach that I just told you, my feeling over the years with my experience is that most of these agencies and departments, they may have very few people that are really understand what the stakeholders and ISP and other people are advocating, but they're limited. And so they're looking for information, and getting to the right person at the right time, which is especially important in grant funding, is very key.
And what's your feeling in terms of communication mix? What's effective? I mean, are substantively written communications effective? Do they typically elicit a response?
Well,
is a phone call offensive or accepted? What about in-person meetings? Talk about that.
Yeah, I have found over the pandemic, the last 2.5 years, operating in this environment, which is totally different from the decades before that I've been involved in, is that most of the staff still are not in the office. And so one of the most effective means of contacting at least government officials, and this could also be for congressional staff, is to present your position and advocate for a Zoom team presentation. That's very popular. And that interaction is very much encouraged. And in fact, you can do more than 1 or 2 or 3 in a day. You don't have to worry about the travel.
And I think, John, just for our work with trying to contact some of the innovation leaders at USDA previously, they like to talk. I mean, I think sometimes they're in their cage, but they're happy to have the interaction of a Zoom meeting. And I think someday when COVID clears, being in person with, they're human beings. I know we all think that they're dried out, desiccated, bureaucrats, but they're just human beings. Most of them are smart as heck about stuff. Maybe they're a little separate from the day-to-day that we all feel in the industry, but I just encourage people. I lived in DC for 18 years. You've been there forever. They put their pants on one leg at a time, just like we all do. Let's not mythologize who they are and think that they're, from another planet. We can communicate with them like we can communicate with our employees and prospects. It's all about making sense and having consideration, right?
Yes, you're absolutely right. The bottom line is that I have advocated for my clients and interacting with colleagues that it's very important to find the right person to organize the presentation and the team that would evaluate what it is that you want. And that includes Congress as well as the government. So there's 3 different phases. The first is to advocate and present your particular point of view, whether there's a standard that has to be met, a guideline, the development of a criteria, or whatever it is. The second would be allocation of funds. Congress is giving the agencies funds. Regulations are being proposed for guidelines. So the second phase is to be able to get in at the right time to make the presentation for your request for funding over the other person. And the last phase is actually the follow-up and implementation, because these funds are not for just one 12-month period. I told you that they're for maybe 5 or 6. And so the allocations continue over and over and over again. So it's just knowing how to present and how to work the system.
Okay. Well, Amy, I don't know whether you're on screen or not. I can see you, maybe nobody else can, but do we have any questions that we should tap into?
I don't see any, but if anyone has any, feel free to unmute and put it in the chat, but I don't see anything.
I see something in chat, but maybe somebody was just heckling from the crowd. Let's see what's there.
That was just me.
Oh, Steve is, okay, Steve is bye-bye. Steve is going to ask a question. All right, well, let's keep going. I just want to touch on these other areas and be sure to get John's contact info up, because I think he's done himself proud in terms of his knowledge and insights here, and I want folks to know where to reach him. But like I said, with the bipartisan support for broadband expansion, and John, to your point that these are multi-year programs, some level of ongoing tracking at the very least of this broadband piece. And I think we're focused mostly on the residential side of things, but as you mentioned earlier, a lot of this goes to the institutional sector as well, with categories like healthcare and education. And so, I think it would be worth continuing to follow and develop content around this. We're interested in feedback from our audience. So any of our viewers, when we put the contact info up at the end, let us know. I think there's a few other areas where there's likely to be strong continuing government involvement and funding for expansion or next generation solutions that I would touch on here. And John, I'll ask you for commentary on those as well. But part of Build Back Better is clean energy. There's a lot of dollars in the drafts of Build Back Better, most on climate change, most of the a real strong focus on the transportation sector and public EV charging. But I think that there's the potential for some of those dollars to maybe be redirected to home charging. We know most EVs, 80% of the charging is going to be done at home. And if we're able to build clean energy solutions around EV charging that also power the home, you can kind of get 2 plays for the quarter. So I think there's some advocacy to be done there. And I think there is going to be, there's likely to be continued government investment in that sector. John, I'll go through them all and then I'll ask you for commentary. Indoor air quality, I don't know what's going on with the stimulus funds that went to the states. A lot of states are sitting on huge cash hoards, but indoor air quality in schools is a continuing huge issue. I don't know whether as an industry, we've done a good job of advocating for disbursement of funds to improve the indoor air quality in schools, but I think that opportunity may be sitting in front of us. And then I think another area where we've seen government involvement and funding support is public safety. We have some huge public safety issues in the country right now, particularly in downtown areas. In terms of our industry, really more blending of technologies that were developed for the private security industry, but going back to our work 25 years ago, John, that can be leveraged for public safety, municipal applications, blending that with law enforcement and social service support may be part of the answer to our downtown security and public safety issues. So those are all categories where I think there's going to be activity that warrants continuing, watching and maybe acting.
My quick comment, and I agree with everything you said. My quick comment is, I've heard on Capitol Hill and in the agencies that there is an interconnectability between the broadband funding, what you just said for next year, in linking homes and office complexes to the buzzword issues that will appear in 2023 and 2024. So for example, public safety, once you're broadband connected, it goes with education, goes with health, all of that is connected within a home and connected within, let's say, a business district. And there's going to be more funding. If you look at the pandemic funding, by the way, as a takeaway, in the CARES Act, billions and billions of dollars flowed into telehealth. And if these bills expand broadband connectivity, which they will, one of the priority areas is for the underserved, unserved, and for equity to be able to have people served with health, which is a key component. So every one of these components has multi-billion-dollar opportunities in the next Congress coming up.
Great. So there is our contact information. I have a Northern Virginia area code for my mobile phone, just like John does, but I am living in Boston now. We'd love to hear from anyone who's taken this webinar in on demand or in person. What was relevant for you? What are you interested in hearing more about? Do you have immediate interest in acting on something, in which case I'd probably direct you to John, because he's got the government relations firm that can take action on stuff. But give us feedback, give us guidance, and we'll see how much and in which areas we can continue serving you all in this space. John, thank you so much. I hope you had fun. Did you have fun?
I did.
You're a happy warrior?
I am a happy warrior.
All right, very good. Amy, thank you for coordinating this stuff. And thanks everybody who came by to listen to us. We went way over, but that's our nature. Take care.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye.